Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with Romana Software and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, a scenario-based approach to Agile test planning and design by Dr. Magdi Hanna. We're excited you're able to join us today. Set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is being sponsored by Romana Software, the leader in application lifecycle technology. For more information about Romana ALM, please visit romanasoftware.com. This webinar is being co-sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit testinginstitute.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Feature-Based Project Management, on October 13th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in this series, go to testinginstitute.com. You may submit your questions at any time by using your question box in your GoToWebinar window. Today's presenter will answer as many questions within the time allowed at the end of today's session. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at testinginstitute.com. At the end of today's webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short survey. At Romana Software, we strive to provide the highest quality educational resources for the public and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to complete this short survey. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Dr. Magdi Hanna. Dr. Hanna?
Thank you, Eric. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. We have a large number of people joining us, even from different countries. Very large number of people for this webinar. It looks like Agile really pushes the right buttons on us, right? Just want to start by saying that this webinar is just a 1 hour condensed session from a full day course that is offered by the International Institute for Software Testing, and the course is available as one of the 70 plus online courses available from IIST if you are interested in more details. But I will promise that I will give you as much as I can give you in 1 hour. This is not a teaser. This is real session that will give you things to think about and to be able to use hopefully in your current projects. I don't know if any one of you here heard me speaking before. I'm sure we get a lot of people coming back for those webinars, whether I do these webinars as part of our effort at Romana Software or part of my effort at the International Institute for Software Testing. I've been involved in both organizations very heavily. But guess what? I don't think I need to waste your time about who I am and what I have done over the years, even if you don't know me, because I guess you get stuck with me for this 1 hour, so you might as well just listen and enjoy it. Let's get started with the more serious stuff. This is the agenda I'm trying to hopefully cover today. It's very brief agenda, but very condensed, very quick. I'm going to talk about characterizing Agile and what Agile is. I know probably the majority of you know what it is, but I need to just to make sure that we are aware of certain things that Agile framework requires us to do. Then I want to touch very quick on the goals of Agile testing. Then we will look into the process of Agile planning, risk analysis, design, and execution. All right. Now, of course, if you have been involved in any Agile projects, you probably have already sensed these things that you can see on the screen. I know, just out of curiosity, I want you to tell me if you are currently involved in an Agile project or not, just to get a count. Nothing important more than for my own information. I want to get a count out of, percentage-wise, how many people are actually involved in an Agile project. So go ahead and I believe I don't have a poll that's been prepared, so go ahead now and just put a note to that, yes or no. I should have prepared a poll. I did not prepare for that poll, but go ahead, say yes or no on the question panel. Again, we all know that Agile is a very fast pace, meaning that we have to do things much faster than what we normally have done in a non-Agile project. How fast it is different from one project to another. We also know that Agile is highly incremental, meaning that we work on one sprint at a time, whether the sprint is 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 1 week, but the incremental nature really requires people requires the development team to push code into the test environment very frequently, sometimes every day, sometimes 5 times a day, sometimes every other day. That's the nature of Agile. Developers will always push new code into your test environment. Agile also is highly iterative in the sense that we may not understand everything about the requirement upfront, but things evolve as we go. So we may be looking at a user story, and the user story is brief, and we take the time to do the sprint planning. We try to size the user story, but as we start working, things can change because we don't have all the details when we start. And this is really the one single characteristic of Agile that affects how we plan and we design for tests. If things are going to change over time while we are working on this in the sprint, then we need to be prepared for that. Also, the fact that typically user stories are much more brief or has much less information than typical requirements, that again requires us to work differently in an Agile project, because typically a user story is brief, high level. Even if you work on a project that takes a large requirement and break it down into a number of user stories, then when it comes down to each individual user story, you don't have the level of details you need to write your tests, and with the same token, developers may not have the level of details they need in order to write the code. We all also know that Agile relies so much on a lot of communication, a lot of collaboration. We try not to document so much, because one of the principles of Agile, as you know, is to not to document or create unnecessary documentation. With that being said, we all know that we may not have a lot of details in the requirements. We may not have time to write a lot of details in test cases and test plans. That's another one that will affect how we plan and design tests. All right. So as everything else, when we start thinking about a way to do things, how are we going to do certain things, whether it's Agile or not, whether it is software or not, it doesn't matter. If we're trying to think about our approach, our means to achieve certain goals, we need to understand what the goals are. So I suggest that you and your team make sure that your goals of software testing in an Agile project is clear to you, all right? And they're not going to be much different from your goals in a non-Agile project, all right? So here are some ideas for you, okay? Of course, you can phrase this any way you want. You can say, I want to make sure the system works the way the requirement is stated. I want to make sure it works as expected. I want to make sure that everything in the user story has been implemented. All that good stuff. But whatever you say here is referring to what I call, or what most people would call, requirement coverage. And the requirement coverage is really about how deep are we testing the functionality. Okay, and that's not focusing on the code. How deep are we testing the functionality as described by the user story or the requirement? Okay, another objective that we should always think about is that how much of the code have we been testing? And I don't know how many of you, from a testing perspective, can tell me that, yes, you always think about how much of the code have we tested. This is very critical, guys, very critical, because you can imagine it doesn't matter from a testing perspective, one more time. From a testing perspective, Imagine how much time you can put in testing based on the user stories or the requirements or the specifications or whatever. It doesn't really matter how much time you put there if there is anything in the code that you have not tested. You really don't know how that segment of code or that block of code will behave in production. That's why it has been always my mission to teach test professionals as well as developers for so many years now, over maybe even 25 years, to teach people how to focus on code coverage. Even if you are unable to look at the code and look at the blocks of code, and because, you know, from a testing perspective, we don't understand how the code is written. So, but the fact that we don't understand how the code is written does not free us from our responsibility to make sure that we are testing as much of the code as possible. I want you to go back today or Monday, when you go back to your organization, to your projects, I want you to sit down and think about this. How or what are we doing as a team, as a test team, and also as a development team? What are we doing to make sure that we are testing as much of the code as possible? There are ways to do this that I'm going to explore with you. But of course, if you are not doing the kind of things I'm going to tell you about, then you must be doing something else. If you're not doing anything, that's a problem. All right? So, okay, when it comes to the objectives, some people just have the simple objective that I just want to find as many bugs as possible. So I'm going to just focus on those three. And I'm sure anything else you could possibly say will fall within those three objectives. Okay? Of course, you can have things like, I want to test as fast as possible. Okay, and we're going to address that as well. But if we focus on these three objectives and say, okay, now as we know our objectives, what are the means by which we can achieve those goals? All right. An agile test process or an agile testing lifecycle is not going to be much different from a non-agile testing lifecycle, except in two things. Every testing lifecycle will always have time for us to plan the testing, then design the testing, and then execute the tests, and then report the bug reports when we find problems. These are four known sub-processes, if you will, or four phases of any testing lifecycle. And they are also essential in agile testing. However, the two differences in the way we do it in Agile is, one, we do them very quick. So maybe in a non-Agile project, these four phases can easily take 2 months or 3 months. Well, guess what? In an Agile project, those four phases probably will take no more than an hour. That's the way it is. And I'll show you how to do this. In fact, it might, in some user stories, for some user stories, it might take less than 1 hour. So the speed by which we do the process is different. And the other difference is that you can see a lot of overlap. So we don't wait until we design all the tests and then we execute them, all right? Or we don't wait until we finish the planning and we start the designing. It's a very much an iterative process by which we can plan the tests and plan a little, design a little, execute a little, write bug reports, and so what I want you to know is that you probably already know that when you start testing in an Agile project, you can be actually running some tests here in an Agile execution, and then you discover that there were few other tests that you didn't even think about. So we want you very quick to go back, jump back to the design and start designing those tests on the fly, documented them lightly, and then go and execute them. And again, this process of going back to a test to design, coming back to run the test should not take about 10 minutes. You might also be here executing a tests and finding a problem and start moving it down. Start moving it down to write a bug report, And while you are writing the bug report in an agile manner, you discover that there might be other tests that you could possibly execute that's related to that test you're running. And you might want to include them in the same bug report. So you go back and run another test quick. Now, if that test has already been written, has already been designed, well, that's great. Then you can go ahead and run that test. And if it also fails, then you include it in the same bug report because they are related tests. If that test was not designed, for example, then guess what? You go back and design it. If we did not do all the planning activity for that test, then you go back and do whatever you need to do to plan the test, as we're going to understand in a little bit, the difference between planning and the design. Then you go and design the test, you can execute the test. So even the bug reporting process can be interrupted in the middle because you're going to go back and run a test quick. And some people say, no, if the test is already there and has already been documented, I will run it. I will run it in connection with the test I already ran, and if it fails, I will include in the bug report here. However, if it doesn't fail, I will also put something in the bug report here that says something like, however, when we do this for this other thing, we don't get the same problem, so the problem is only here. So you can write your bug report in a way that says which test failed and why and how it failed, and also which other related tests passed. So you can say this feature here works from that screen fine, but when I tried it from that screen, it does not work, something like that. All right, so I don't think I need to speak too much about this. So it's a highly iterative process where you can go back and forth between the different phases anytime. So let's now move to what does the Agile methodology work. Okay, the dashed line in the middle of the screen here kind of separates between what we do in planning versus what we do in design. It's not something critical. I just want to show you what activities I will consider to be test planning activities versus what other activities are considered to be test design activities. Okay? So at the top, as you can see, you might be starting from a user story. And most Agile projects using Scrum methodology will start with a user story. Some will start with requirements and break it down, those requirements, into user stories. And for some reason, some people somehow start with user stories and produce requirements out of that. I'm not sure exactly how that would work. I'm just looking at screen here that tells me that my voice is too loud. So I'm going to keep the microphone away from my mouth a little bit. So as I said, some people tell me that no, we start with a user story and we take that user story, break it down into requirements. You know, I think this is doing things backward. Normally a requirement includes much more stuff than a user story, and the decomposition or decomposing a requirement to a user story is a way to simplify or to break down the requirement in a way that we can handle one piece at a time. All right. Of course, some Agile projects will also have user interface. Whether those user interfaces are, I mean, when I say user interface here, I mean screen prototypes. Now, whether those screen prototypes are your starting point or not, I mean, an Agile team, as you probably know, can be doing screen prototypes for a user story that have identified. As a result, we have user stories. We have also user interface. And some Agile projects will actually, as I've seen them doing it, they will not have user stories. They have requirements, and they break the requirement to pieces, and they work with them like that. And I've seen a number of Agile teams who would say, no, we don't use user stories because we don't like them, because they are brief, so we work from the requirements. So don't be surprised. So I run Agile projects myself, and I don't use user stories, I use requirements. Why? Because I have so much details that I want to put in a requirement, and I keep my requirement simple to address or to handle what is to be handled with a typical user story. Now, I'm sure by now you realize that there are two different shades of colors in this chart. And so the darker shade on the right refers to the more formal activities. So I have reasons to believe that if an Agile project is actually using requirements as opposed to user stories or user interface, now that project uses a level of formality a little bit higher than another project that simply uses user stories. Why? Because user requirements have much more details, as I said, and you can use them to do more stuff in the development side and in the testing side. Now, some Agile projects, you probably know that, uses a concept of use cases on the right. Now, I want to make sure that if you have not seen use cases before, use cases are very, very different from user stories. They are actually probably on the two extreme ends of things. User stories are kind of one line that's phrased in a certain format that says as a role of the application, I want to be able to do this because of this. All right. Sorry, getting a lot of messages on my screen here, so I'm a bit distracted. Okay, so that's one extreme. The other extreme is the use cases, and use cases typically have much more details. If you have not seen use cases before, very briefly, they contain a number of actors, and those are the actors that are interacting together, and those actors are probably all the users involved in the system. They also can involve other systems that are involved, and then it has all these main scenarios, alternate scenarios, and so on. So that's why if you're using use cases, by nature of the use cases, you also have what we call use case scenarios. And those use case scenarios are different from what I'm talking about here, down here as scenarios. Okay. If you are using use cases, then you are sort of on the more formal track where you produce use case scenarios and you go further to the more formal approach. Now, if you are using one of the other three, or requirements, or user stories, or user interface, I suggest that you'll have a time in your project where you'll be able to ask questions. And in an Agile project, we don't have a lot of time to ask questions because sometimes those Agile or Scrum meetings that last for 10-15 minutes are not the time to ask lots of questions. But however, most Agile practices will actually believe and support a lot of collaboration. To the point that you can actually walk into anyone's cubicle or anyone's office anytime, ask any questions you want. I personally, based on my experience, do not encourage much of verbal questions, because the minute we allow people to walk to each other's cubicles or offices to ask questions, and we don't write those questions somewhere, and we don't write the answer somewhere, then things fall through the cracks. And some members of the team will not be informed about the details. Just think about what happens in your project when you walk to the product owner or the Agile coach, or you walk to a developer and ask them a question, and you get an answer for that question. I don't think you go and publish the question you asked and publish the answer you received for that question. So I have a process by which all questions, all answers must be always documented online. I'm not suggesting that we create a new document that we call it Q&A. No, I'm talking about a collaborative tool that will help you post questions about any user story or about any requirement or about any screen anytime, and you should be able to get an answer anytime. Not waiting for the next meeting, not waiting for someone to answer the question, because you don't actually even know who's supposed to be answering the question. So I call this online collaborative reviews. And Romana ALM as a tool supports this very heavily, but I'm also sure that there are other tools that are collaborative tools can support that. The point is you have to be able to ask a question anytime. When you ask a question, everyone in the team can see the question. The question must be answered anytime, and everyone can see the answer. Not only that, but people have the chance to react to the answers. So we have an open forum there where people can collaborate around a user story or around a screen or around a requirement. Okay. Now, that whole box of questions and answers should not take more than a couple hours. Okay. At the same time, someone will be starting writing the scenarios. So some of you might be wondering if you have not seen scenarios before. Actually, you might know that scenarios mean different things to different people. In my process, scenarios are a very different thing. If they're one sentence that describes a specific situation or a specific condition that could possibly happen in production. If you have taken any of my courses, I am sure you've been exposed to this concept of scenario. The concept of scenario is amazing, is amazingly powerful because a test engineer or a developer or a product owner can sit down with the user story and they break it down into a number of scenarios, and every one of those scenarios will represent a possible condition. So if I am trying to register for a course at the IIST website, and that is what the user story is all about, then some of the scenarios are things simple. Registering for a course that I have already registered for it before. Registered for a course that I have not registered for it before. Registered for a course that I have attended. Registering for a course that I am paying by credit card. Registering for a course and requesting to pay by check. Registering for a course, and so on. So everything, okay, even things like I got disconnected from the internet while I'm trying to register for a course. That's a scenario. We call those things abnormal scenarios. Again, one more time, if you attended any of my courses, I mean, I have a 3-day course that's called the best practices in software test planning and design that really spells out that process, and you create those scenarios and so on. So with no further ado, a scenario is nothing more than one line only that describes a very specific situation or condition. So you can take a user story roughly as we do it in the class. We take one user story and create up to 30 or 40 scenarios. There are not 4 or 5 scenarios. If I see 4 or 5 scenarios for a user story, then I say something went wrong. And some people say, oh, maybe the user stories you're talking about are very huge. Maybe you should break them down into smaller user stories. No. I'm talking about the simplest user story that's meaningful to the user. Well, if we're going to call it user story, it has to be something meaningful to the user. Okay? So a user story would be something like, as a customer, I'd like to be able to register for a course online. Okay? Don't break this down further, because if you break it down further, it's meaningless. Okay, I don't think we're going to create this down to break this down to something that says, as a customer, I'd like to pay for the course. Well, pay for what course? So whatever, even if you say, as a customer, I'm going to pay for the course, then you're talking about a larger number of scenarios as well. All right. Now, once you have those scenarios, one important thing about the scenarios is that we have to agree on them. Now, when I say we have to agree, who are we? The project team, the Agile coach, the product owner, the Scrum Master, the developers, the testers, anyone else. All right, why? Because those are like contracts. If I am a tester and I'm writing those scenarios, I am telling the developer in many ways, those are the scenarios that I'm going to use down to write my test cases. If the developer does not agree with those scenarios, then we need to know right now. I don't need to wait until I write my test cases and I write my script and I run the script and I find a problem. and then we can come back and say, well, because I wrote a scenario that the developer did not agree with. Okay, that does not make any sense. So there is a process here during the scenario development process. It's a scenario validation process. We validate scenarios amongst ourselves, and this is a very critical process. We need to agree all on the scenarios, and not only that, but we also need to agree on the expected behavior of each scenario, meaning that if that scenario were to happen in the field, how would the system handle it? So the consensus on the expected behavior is very critical as well, because I can write scenarios, a developer say, yep, that's fine, I think you're right, that could possibly happen, but if we are not in agreement in terms of how we expect the system to handle the scenario, then we're back to square one. I'm going to write my test cases based on what I believe to be an expected behavior, and the developer is going to write the code based on he or she would believe to be the expected behavior, and then we disagree at the time after I run my test. We cannot do this in an Agile project or even in a non-Agile project. So the outcome of the Agile test planning is a set of validated scenarios, a set of agreed upon scenarios. Absolutely. If you're using use cases, you also have the set of use case scenarios that have been validated. Now keep in mind, in one project, in some user stories we can be writing scenarios here informally as one line, or we can be doing use cases, and so you could easily have a combination of use case scenarios, and also scenarios in the simple sense I'm explaining. All right. Again, one more time, I didn't think that 1 hour would be enough to really just explain in details of what the scenario process is, and there's so much details about how we build the scenarios, who's supposed to build them, how do we go about finding those scenarios, and so on. But it's a critical process, guys. If we move to the next process, which is the test design, without exploring all the scenarios and without agreeing on all the scenarios and all the expected behavior of those scenarios, then we're having a problem. Now, I know someone will say, but remember, Agile is an iterative process. Why don't we move down and we go ahead and start our test design while we don't have all the scenarios? And I'm okay with that, as long as the percentage of unidentified scenarios is not that high. So I'm willing to move down with no less than 80% of my scenarios. I don't want to have a tester taking a user story here and asking a few questions and they're coming up with 5 to 10 scenarios and moving it down to write formal test cases or exploratory test cases, moving it down to the test design, and not being able to discover 20 or 30 other scenarios that he or she did not think about. That's dangerous. You know why? Because I have no guarantee that this person will actually, in fact, be able to find those other 20 or 30 scenarios. So that's why I put a lot of emphasis on the scenario validation process and the collaborative nature of the scenario development. So when scenarios are developed and validated, that's a collaborative effort. In one of my courses, I show people very well how working individually does not work. I show that any individual, no matter who he or she is not able to come up with more than 20 to 30% of the scenarios that are supposed to be supported by the system. So as a result, I always recommend that scenario development is a collaborative effort. I know some of you are going to say, how are we going to do this? The mechanism by which we do scenarios. Again, I suggest the use of collaborative tools, because if I have already put my user story on that collaborative tool, if I already asked questions and recorded the answers in that collaborative tool. There is nothing that says now we can go as developers, as testers, as product owners and start writing the scenarios for that user story. And for the collaborative tool, if it allows people to see things in real time, then I am looking here, I'm sitting here looking at the scenarios that were written by my tester an hour ago or 10 minutes ago. And I can react to them and I can possibly put a recommendation for other scenarios that I believe he or she are missing. Or I can react to the expected behavior that this person has put for his scenario. The person said, here is a scenario, here is the expected behavior, I can step in online in real time. I says, no, that is not how it's supposed to react, but this is how it's supposed to react. It's an iterative, collaborative process. It has to be this way. If we want to do Agile and we want to be successful in Agile, it has to be iterative, collaborative in real time. And if the product owner is not around today to react to my scenarios, he or she can be around tomorrow to look at my scenarios online and be able to react to them to see if I am on the right track or not, or I'm missing something. All right? So that's very critical. So let me now, I'm going to leave the rest of this slide that has to do with Agile test design. We're going to get back to it in a little bit. But before we move on, I want to show you this other slide. This is very much the one we're looking at. The upper half is the same. I changed the lower half a little bit. And the lower half now is talking about Agile development. Because whenever I explain this process to Agile teams, they come back and say, but how does this fit with our test-driven development effort that's done by our developers? And in test-driven development, and I'm sure you probably know that already, developers take the user story or the requirement, and instead of writing the code directly, they go and write test cases for their unit testing. And then they start writing code to pass those test cases that they wrote. And they run the tests. They run the test. If the test fails, they go back and modify the code. And they keep modifying the code until the tests they wrote pass. Then they write more tests. And, you know, based on how some of the test-driven development gurus say, they say developers will write a test that fails first. And it fails because you don't have the code to support it. So they write a test and then they write the code to support it. Then they run the test. If the test fails, then they modify the code. If the test passes, then they go and write another test. And they keep doing this. And as a result, really honestly, when developers follow a test-driven development process, we are guaranteed that every line of code and every block of code that has been written has also been tested. Why? Because developers will not write code unless they have tests for that, which is a great thing, by the way. Test-driven development is great. But over the years, we started to find problems with test-driven development. And the problem I've seen immediately once test-driven development was published and practiced is that developers may not write enough tests based on the user stories. So although test-driven development may guarantee a higher levels of code coverage because every line of code and every block of code has been tested, they may not at all guarantee any level of user story coverage. And that's a problem. Now, of course, we can say, all right, that's fine. At least we made sure that developers have been testing every code they write, and we're going to let the test team focus on user story coverage. Yes, but again, if testers try to write test cases for the user stories that developers do not agree on, we are back on the same square. So here's how I believe test-driven development should work. Instead of developers taking a requirement or a user story to write their unit testing test cases, as you can see here, they're taking the scenarios. So the scenarios from the test planning phase. Now, suddenly, we do not want to call it test planning anymore, because it's not just a test planning. It's a test planning and it's development planning. What we do above the red line here, everything here, is not only testing. It's testing and development. That's why I call my approach scenario-based testing and development. Why? Because when we think about scenarios, when we practice scenarios, we're not practicing scenarios only for testing. It's a development approach. And then suddenly developers can take those scenarios that have been validated and they use them as an input to their design of the unit testing test cases. So now the test-driven development is taking scenarios as the input or the starting point, not the requirements and not the user stories. However, at the same time, developers will take those scenarios and start writing the design as well. They might do this at the same time. They might do the design first, then they come back and write the test cases. Once they write some test cases for the unit testing, they start writing the code that supports those test cases. And so on, they execute the code, and as I said, if the code fails, they go and modify it again, and so on, and until the tests pass, they go and write more test cases and so on. So all what I'm saying in this diagram is two things, actually. One, developers will rely on scenarios to write their design, whether it is detailed design, database design, user interface design, whatever. And of course, as always, they're going to go from design to write the code. But if the team is practicing test-driven development, then they will take the scenario and start writing test cases, and they will use those test cases to write the code and so on. So this screen is about how test-driven development fits in this scenario process, or in other words, how scenarios can improve the test-driven development process. So now with scenarios, as we can see, we improved the test-driven development process. We improved the code coverage, and from a testing perspective, we can also say that the more scenarios we write, the more coverage of the user story we have. All right, I want to take you to the next slide, which simply lists the activities of test planning. Okay, which is everything we talked about above the line. We want to know what features we're testing, i.e. what user stories, what dependencies between them. Okay, because if we're handling 3 or 4 or 5 user stories in one sprint, then we need to know the dependencies between those user stories, but most importantly, what scenarios are we going to be testing for each one of those? I've used the word feature, by the way, here generically to mean a user story or a requirement. However, we are identifying your features. So if you are purely Agile project that's using Scrum and user stories, then you can replace the word features by the word user story. So what user stories will be testing, what kind of dependencies between them, and most importantly, what scenarios for each one of these user stories. Again, test planning, in my opinion, is all about understanding the user story coverage, the depth to which we are going to test our user stories. Okay, now we go further and says, what environment are we going to be considering for tests? What I'm talking about here, not the test environment, I'm talking the production environment. And the environment here could mean different things to different people. I mean, if I'm talking about a web-based application, then the environment is web browsers and so on. what operating systems, if the operating system affects the behavior of the application. Now, if we're talking about mobile devices, then we're talking about what devices, what operating systems, what versions, and all that stuff. So we think about the environment for which we're going to be testing. And the last thing in test planning, as I said, is expected behavior of each one of those scenarios. We must come to an agreement. If I have a scenario that I am going to use to create my tests, and the developer is going to use to write code, then we might as well agree right now on how the system should handle that scenario. We do not want to wait until test cases are written, code is written, test cases are executed, and then we discover that the expected behavior has not been agreed upon, and the tester has certain expected behavior in mind, and the developer has certain expected behavior. That's a no-no, and no one should use the word iterative as an excuse here, because I've heard it more than once. People say, but remember, it's an iterative process, so we may not really know exactly what the expected behavior is until we run the tests. That's a no-no. I do not want to discover the expected behavior of a system at the time we are running the tests and go back and modify the test cases and or the code and go back and redo it again. No. Iterative, by the way, iterative does not mean that we work based on ignorance. Iterative means that we are willing to start without all the details, and we're willing to get more details as we go, and that's okay, but not to start with a wrong understanding and correct the wrong understanding at a later point. All right, there's a big difference between the two. Okay, now how do we start our test planning? Very simple. Most likely this list of user stories that will be tested are being given to you. So the first bullet have been already answered, which is what features we're going to be testing. You already know when you come to sprint planning, there has been an agreement already on what user stories we have agreed upon testing. So I doubt that you're going to get into this situation where you have to create your own list of features. But keep in mind, there are some projects that claim they are Agile, but they're not really Agile in the sense that they don't even have the user stories and they don't know what will be included in the sprint or the release. Okay, but in very much, if this is a good disciplined Agile process or Agile practice, you will have your user stories. But then what you need to create the scenario, and you go through the scenario development and validation process. But here is the most important thing, is now as we have much more scenarios than what we can ever test, then we need to adopt a risk-based testing process. Very quick here. So I'm going to tell you this, if you follow the scenario process and you come up with scenarios, you will always have that problem of having too many scenarios that you may not even have time to test. So what you do is a simple risk-based testing here that's based on 3 factors: impact of failure, frequency of occurrence, and probability of failure. What's important here is that I am doing the risk analysis based on scenarios, not based on test cases. I have not created my test cases yet, and I should not waste time to create test cases for scenarios that I am not going to have time to test anyway. So that's really an important thing about scenario-based process, is that it allows me to do my risk analysis on the scenario level, not to wait until I write my test cases and then decide on which tests I'm going to run. That's a waste of time. However, keep in mind, developers may take all the scenarios that have been agreed upon and have been validated, and they go and write code for that, or they go and write unit test cases for that. So let me go back to the slide here very quick. So developers may take all the scenarios. So you took one user story, you came up with, say, 40 scenarios. And the truth is, you're not going to have time to test all 40 scenarios. Fine. But developers need to write code for those. I mean, we're not going to exclude scenarios. We're not going to exclude scenarios and say the system will not support those scenarios because they're not important. Okay, unless, now that's why in the scenario validation process here, a decision has to be made. Is that scenario part of that user story or not? And if it is not, that means that it's outside the scope of the user story, then we're not going to worry about it. So it gets removed from the set of scenarios. But if a decision has been made that those scenarios are actually within the scope, then developers are going to take those and implement, do the design, the coding, they do the unit testing and so on. But let me go back to the previous slide now. So, but from a testing perspective, we're not going to go and write formal test cases for every single scenario, okay? Because writing formal test cases and writing automated scripts is going to take time. So as a result, we perform the risk-based analysis here. And we reduce the number of scenarios from 40 down to 30 or 25. Based on what? Based on those factors that I was sharing with you. So impact of failure, either high or medium or low. Frequency is high or medium or low. And probability of failure, which is kind of tricky because a lot of people don't understand that one. This is the likelihood for that scenario to fail in the field. Because obviously, if I have a good feel, if the probability of failure of that scenario is low, meaning that if I were to test it, I have a good feel that it will pass, it will work fine, then it would be a waste of my time to try to test it. You only test the scenarios that you think have a higher or medium probability of failure, but also they have to have high impact of failure and you believe are going to happen very often. Based on these parameters, you can consider, if you consider high to be 3 and medium to be 2 and low to be 1 on a scale from 1 to 3, you can easily calculate a number here, and this can be calculated in an Excel spreadsheet, and this is one of the reports in the Romana ALM, you know, right there. So it gives you a list of all the scenarios for, it goes user story by user story. For each user story, it gives you all the list, all the scenarios, and it ranks those scenarios like that. And it allows you to see which scenarios have a higher priority of testing, and that's based on the 3 factors. So the number here, the testing priority here, will always be a number between 1 and 3. Okay, because simply if you take a number between 1 and 3 and add 3 of those together, calculate the average, it's always that. It's always between 1.0 and 3.0. So as an example here, for example, 3 plus 3, that's 6, plus 2, that's 8. If you divide 8 by 3, it's 2.66. That's the testing priority of scenario number 9, which is much higher than the testing priority of scenario number 2, and so on. So now some people will ask, what am I going to do with those other scenarios that I'm not going to test? There's a number of things you can do. Okay, we'll see them we'll see those in a little bit. As I already shared with you, so let's assume that you started with one user story and you came up with 40 scenarios or 30 scenarios, and then you found out that you're going to be testing only 15 of those scenarios. One thing to happen is that developers will go ahead and take those scenarios and write the unit test cases, and they're writing the code. So those scenarios will be tested here. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is, I'm going to go further here to the tested design, to the Agile tested design, and I can see here I have only 5 minutes, so let me see how I can finish that. So let me leave that screen and bring the chart one more time. So the Agile tested design is below, it's what's below the red line here. So you take those scenarios. As you can see, we may continue on the right-hand side here for the formal path, or we may go to the left-hand side with the less formal path. Typically, If you have scenarios and you have been validated and you perform the risk analysis and you reduce the number of scenarios, you will go and write what I call formal test cases. And the formal test cases here, I have a definition for it in the slide, in the presentation here. A formal test case has the input, the precondition, the output, the post-condition, and that's another part of my training, and it's covered in some of my training courses at IIST. But again, formal testing, whatever it is, I mean, this is my own formal test process or formal test design process, but I'm sure you have your own way of writing your test cases. All what I'm saying in this slide is that you're going to take some of those scenarios and take them through your formal test design process to write your test cases. I'm going to show you what a test case is. Now, once you write a group of test cases that you feel you could execute them all together, so you group those test cases into a test set. So a test set is nothing more than a group of test cases that can be executed all together using what? Using one script. So that's why you're writing either an automated script or a manual script for a test set, which consists of a number of test cases. And why are we doing this? Because we want to reduce the number of scripts we write, whether they are automated scripts or manual scripts. We do not want to write scripts, and I want to remind you with that. You do not want to write a script, automated or manual, for each test you want to run. You want to write the scripts only for a group, for groups of test cases that we're going to refer to as a test set. Now, for those other scenarios that you thought have a lower priority of testing, you can take them through the informal exploratory testing, or sometimes I call it ad hoc testing, but a lot of people don't like the word ad hoc, but it is really ad hoc in the sense that I am not going to take that scenario and write formal test cases and write scripts. I'm going to execute the scenario as is. So I go into the system and I run these scenarios one after another. I execute scenarios. That's what I call scenario execution. Sometimes I refer to it as the desperate solution. Simply saying, I don't have time, I have 45 scenarios, I can only design tests for that many, but I have others that I need to test. I'm going to sit down for a couple hours to test all of them informally. That's all what I'm saying. You may write scripts or you may not. You may group them into test cases or not. Okay, but this whole informal exploratory process is different. Of course, some people say, well, we still have to write manual script then because we want potentially to automate it. Of course, you do. But if you don't have time, what do? Do you rather sit down and write manual scripts that you will never have time to execute them? Or you'd rather sit down and just run the tests? All right. So that's a test design process. Let me go back to the slide that I skipped just to show you what the activities of test design is. And they're simple. So we decide on what input we do, valid and invalid. We also think about preconditions, because preconditions are possible part of the test cases. Simply preconditions are, what state of the system we're going to think about, which means, for example, if I'm going to run a test case about someone is canceling a course, have they taken the course or not? That's a precondition. Is this course fully refundable or not? That's a precondition. Has this course been canceled before or not? That's a precondition, and so on. So when you start thinking preconditions and we start to think about expected results, then you're talking test cases. So here is the exploratory test case definition, and here is the formal test case definition. No, actually, I don't have the formal test case. Here it is. Here's the formal test case definition. It has test case number, a title, or something. Then you have the input, the preconditions, the output, and post conditions. The expected preconditions and the actual precondition. Sorry, the expected post conditions and the actual post conditions. This is a huge process that I teach also in my class, but I wanted to show you, this is not my concern now, I wanted to show you the higher level process. We are done with our time. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you were able to come up with to get something out of this. I understand an hour is not enough, but the course is available online. I'm not using this to do a sales pitch for the course, but trust me, I've tried to give you as much as I could and to give you a pointer to the courses we have if you are. And of course, don't forget that all these features and all this process is supported by the Romana ALM tool. Now, the Romana ALM tool is available for free to use for up to 5 people, not one person. When I say available for free, it's not a trial version or anything like that. It is a full-blown commercial version available to use for free for small teams of up to 5 people. So keep that in mind. The whole process, everything I explained, is implemented in the tool. And the whole process also explained in much more details in some of the courses by the International Institute for Software Testing. With that, thank you so much for being with me, and I will leave the session to Eric now. Eric?
Thank you, Dr. Hanna, for your time today, and I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by Romana Software and the International Institute for Software Testing. Please be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Feature-Based Project Management, on October 13th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. You can register for this webinar at testinginstitute.com. You can follow both IIST and Romana Software on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more information about news, events, and other promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day. Thank you again, Dr. Hanna.
Thank you, Eric.